Suddenly got very quiet. I think that's my cue to start. So good to see everybody. My name is Ken Wainstein, and I'm honored to be able to chair today's event. And good to see everybody. Today we're going to spend a number of hours talking about biological attribution, challenges and solutions. And this is, of course, the Blue Ribbon Study Panel on Biodefense. And proud to be up here with my colleagues who are all going to introduce themselves in a minute. But before we get started, I first want to recognize Alice Hill, who is over here. We'd love to have you come on up for a second. Alice is with the Hoover Institution, and they have very kindly allowed us to use this wonderful space and work very closely with us, arranging today's event. So, Alice, on behalf of the whole panel, I want to say thank you very much for your efforts and your friendship and coordination on this, and love to have you make a few remarks if you would.
Sure. I just want to say welcome to the Hoover Institution, and we are very honored to be hosting the Blue Ribbon Study Panel. I came into contact with the really excellent work of this panel when I was in the White House with President Obama, Senior Director for Resilience Policy, and their first report, I can tell you, resonated within the halls of the White House. Made very cogent recommendations for how we can better prepare ourselves for biological events. I've followed their work since, and certainly they've had great success with the NBAA and continue to bring attention to just the really important issue of biological risk. Unfortunately, as we see, sometimes the urgent takes over the important, but this is a vital importance to the security of the United States. So the Hoover Institution was really delighted to have this opportunity to help support these efforts. So thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to hearing what you come up with today on this very important topic of attribution. So thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Very kind of you, and this is a great crowd. So let me go ahead and start off first. As you know, we have the ex officio members over to our left, and Asha and Ellen. Special thanks to Asha for really carrying a lot of the weight, putting this thing together today, and done a great job.
Thank you, sir.
And thank you to both of you for all your great work. You've really been the ones to make the panel tick, and also to the ex officio members as well. Let me go ahead and just give a bit of a teaser about the topic that we're addressing today, and that is attribution. Attribution in the context of biodefense. And now we've been up and running now for, what, 2 years?
3.
Oh, 3. See? Time flies when you're having fun. But we have been looking at biodefense and the bio threat from numerous angles, and it's been eye-opening for me, somebody who's spent his career in law enforcement and intelligence community, but and spent some time working in the bio area. But I tell you, this has been an education into a serious threat, the various dimensions of the threat, the various avenues of response to the threat, and taking a sort of a clear-eyed view of what the government has done and hasn't done to meet that threat. And it's been an education, and a very serious one, in the sense that if anything, our message has been this is a very serious threat, and it's one that we need to wrestle with. It's one that the government needs to pay a lot of attention to, not just in terms of moving boxes around the org chart, not just in terms of throwing a little funding at it, but in terms of really focusing on the threat and seeing how we can both prevent the threat from materializing and then responding to it if it does. One of the dimensions is attribution. And attribution is simply that. It's being able to, in the aftermath of some kind of bio attack, and we're talking about bio attack here as opposed to naturally occurring, identifying what the biological agent is, where it came from, and then who might have been behind its creation and dissemination. Just the same kind of thing that myself, as a longtime prosecutor, and other prosecutors and law enforcement folks, some of whom you're going to hear from today, have spent their careers doing, whether it's attribution, with a fingerprint, or attribution with a shell casing from a gun that identifies who the shooter was and where the shooting happened. Same kind of idea in the biodefense area. And that's critical not only for prosecution as a response to a bio attack, but also just for national decision makers in calibrating and deciding how they're going to respond to a biotech, especially if it's one that comes from a state actor. And it all comes back to the ability to attribute the biological agent and attribute it to a particular wrongdoer. And if you think about it, you look across the spectrum of weapons of mass destruction, there's been a good bit of thought put into how to do this in the radiological and in the nuclear area. I mean, there's a law that talks about this. There's been a lot of thought, protocols put in place, practiced, and the like in the government, so that if there were to be a radiological or nuclear event of some kind, an attack, everybody in the government knows who's responsible for each aspect of the attribution process and the response process, down to the very, every position is identified as to who's going to do what, even down to the point that the person, you know who it is who would brief the president on that very issue. That's not the case in the biodefense realm. And we talked about this issue in our 2015 report, the Blueprint for Biodefense. And we raised the concerns that not enough has been done in the attribution area for biodefense, and little has changed since then. That's one of the recommendations or concerns that we flagged that has really not gotten a lot of traction in terms of response to it. And so our hope today is that with the help of the experts who we're going to have here today, that we can help the current administration and the federal government, and for that matter, our state and local partners, figure this issue out and think about how we can better put a process in place that better and more quickly can identify the wrongdoers in the case of a bio attack, which is something that is sadly and soberingly enough is a real threat. So that's our purpose today, and let me first, before we get into the panels, I want to turn over to my colleagues. We're very fortunate to have some of America's greatest public servants on this panel, and two of them are up here with me today. And let me first turn to Senator Daschle for your remarks.
Well, Ken, thank you very much. You've, I think, eloquently laid out what our challenge is today and our purpose in getting together. And like you, I want to thank Hoover and certainly Asha and Ellen for all of the good work that they've done to prepare us for this important discussion. And as always, I thank Joe Lieberman for his extraordinary leadership on this panel. It's been my pleasure to work with him for decades, and it's no accident that he's here again today, even though this is not an area that he originally, like me, knew much about. I've been affected a great deal by the whole question of attribution, in part because of personal experience. It was 16 years ago, this month actually, that we had the horrific anthrax attack in my office, and we went through a very traumatic time. And I'm very cognizant of how relevant that experience is to today's discussion. I would say that as horrific as that whole experience was, what's troubling to me is the aftermath and the lack of our capacity for attribution, frankly. We did a lot of the things you'd expect. We had investigations, and we had decontamination, and we had environmental remediation, and we had medical prophylactics, and we did all of those things. We had a plan, but we realized quickly that we had no capacity, in large measure because we lacked the science and technology to follow through with that plan. And so over the last 16 years, I think we've made progress on microbiology, and we can look back with maybe some satisfaction. But the fact is that we have a long way to go. A long way to go with regard to forensics, a long way to go with regard to biological attribution, and the challenges remain, even though it's now been 16 years. And so the purpose today is really to take some of the best minds that we have in the country, literally, and to think through just how we might move the needle and how we might address these challenges more effectively. And I'm looking forward to having this discussion and thoughtfully thinking how we might make even more concrete recommendations on how to address this issue more effectively going forward.
Thanks very much, Ken. Tom, thanks for your kind words. And I know that you and I both agree that even though we've known each other for decades, we remain very young. That's right. At heart, relatively speaking. Welcome to everybody, and a particular thanks in my role as co-chair of the Blue Ribbon Study Panel on Biodefense with Tom Ridge, former governor, former Secretary of Homeland Security. To Ken and Tom for seizing the initiative on this hearing and really preparing, along with the help, obviously, of Ash and Ellen, excellent hearing today. I'm glad to be here, frankly, just to learn. I've been engaged by this subject. I'm going to take about a minute to just explain to those who don't know what is the Blue Ribbon Study Panel on Biodefense. It was not created by either the executive branch of government or by Congress. It was motivated by some people who felt that, just as Tom has just said, that we reacted in some ways that were consequential to the events of 9/11 and other events. But we had not yet done enough, that the federal government was spending a lot of money on defense against both a bioterrorist attack, but also the related problem, which we will only coincidentally touch on today, I guess, of an infectious disease epidemic or pandemic, which can kill enormous numbers of people. You know, we're approaching the 100th anniversary, and you'll be hearing about this a lot, I'm sure, of the flu epidemic of 1918, in which the estimates are that 50 to 100 million people died. I mean, and that was before we were all traveling as much as we are today, and all the rest. And anyway, we've made we've issued a couple of reports. So the people who were concerned about this came to Tom Ridge and me. They went to some funders and said, we really need a small bipartisan group to get together and review where we are and make nonpartisan proposals on this, which is what we've been about. This panel of ours is quite small. It's the three of us, plus Donna Shalala, former Secretary of HHS, Tom Ridge, who I mentioned, and Jim Greenwood, who was a former member of Congress, now the head of the bio organization. And so we're here as part of that. I'm really interested in this subject matter insofar as it helps us to determine as quickly as we can, perhaps in the first instance, so it's not directly on point, whether we're dealing with a naturally occurring infectious disease outbreak or a bioterrorist attack. But more to the point of a bioterrorist attack, this not only has the normal criminal law implications of finding out who did it so you can punish that person or persons and therefore deter the next group from doing it, but obviously if it's a genuine bioterrorist attack against the United States, it has the most profound implications for our foreign policy and our national security policy. And one could imagine, if you can, the attribution is important if nobody's claiming credit, neither a state or a non-state actor. Attribution is important to determine what the response of the United States will be. There are really important questions that I think have not been answered for biological weapons, as Ken said, as they have been for nuclear weapons. For instance, at what point and how would the National Command Authority be engaged? How long do we wait until the Department of Defense moves if it's decided that this was an act of war? These are really serious questions, and I'm afraid to say, and you all know it because my guess is you're at least as informed as we are on these subjects. This threat is not diminishing. At least Russia is known to continue to have a biological weapons program. There are other a gallery of the normal rogue states enemies like Iran, North Korea, which also are suspected of Syria of having an active chemical weapons program. In the case of Syria, we're no longer suspecting, since we know that Assad has used chemical weapons in recent years. And we also know from open sources that terrorist groups like the Islamic State are working on developing biological weapons. So this is a real and clear and present danger. And the subject of attribution, which seems highly technical, perhaps legalistic, and maybe it is both of those, is critically important in enabling our government and our legal system to put together a rational response to such an attack. So thanks again to Ken and Tom for organizing this hearing. Thanks to the extraordinary group of witnesses we're going to have. And I just look forward to continuing my education in this critical national subject matter. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Senator Lieberman, Senator Daschle. Okay, why don't we go ahead and call up the first panel, and that's Dr. Jerry Parker, our an ex officio member, Nicholas Dunaway, and Supervisory Special Agent Ed Yu. Let me just say this at first. We originally were scheduled to have Representative Susan Brooks testify at the outset of the meeting. She, at the last minute, had some emergency committee business that required her to be up on the Hill this morning. She had to send her regrets, which is too bad on a number of levels. She's a tireless champion of biodefense, and we spent a lot of time working with her and her staff, but her individually. Secondly, she's a former prosecutor, U.S. attorney for many years, so she really knows this attribution area and understands it. And third, she's an old friend. We were U.S. attorneys together, and so very much looking forward to having her here, and she regrets not being here, but I can assure you that she remains very active in this space and a really important force up on Capitol Hill. So let me give a quick, just very quick bio of each of our panelists. Thank you for being here today. First, on my far right, Dr. Jerry Parker. He's an ex officio member of the panel here. He's currently the director of the Institute for Infectious Animal Diseases at Texas A&M. He's former commander and deputy commander of the U.S. Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases and held a variety of positions at DHS, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response at HHS, and Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Chemical and Biological Defense at DOD. So he's been pretty much everywhere. He is a true expert. And in fact, Jerry and I testified together. The two of us were up on a panel being asked very specific questions. He'd get asked a very specific question. He'd have this encyclopedic response. He'd walk through it as though it was a doctoral thesis. Then they'd ask me the same question. I'd just say whatever he said. And so it's nice to be able to testify with somebody like that. Nicholas Dunaway, good to see you. He is currently with Inspirion and is a well-known expert in the area of biosecurity and cybersecurity. Former FBI special agent working in weapons of mass destruction. He's led a number of biological, chemical WMD investigations, and that resulted in apprehensions of the wrongdoers, people who either did or were conspiring to use biological material or chemical material to cause damage to others, and people who trafficked in those areas. So he'll be able to speak about his expertise both from within the government and outside the government. And then we have current Special Agent, Supervisory Special Agent Ed Yu. Good to see you. He is the Supervisory Special Agent in the FBI's Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate, which was stood up maybe a dozen years ago or so after 9/11, correct? And he's in the Biological Countermeasures Unit, so he's the perfect man to talk about this area. And he has deep experience as an FBI agent, well trained in all areas of attribution, in other words, investigation and forensic work, but specifically has expertise that's specifically applicable to today's topic. So, thank you, gentlemen, for being here today, and I will start, let's just start on the right, if that's okay.
Well, thank you and good morning. And Since I'm the first speaker, I take it on as my responsibility to begin to kind of set the stage for the discussion and debates of the day. So, Honorable Wainstein, Senator Daschle, and Senator Lieberman, and my esteemed panelists, thank you for inviting me to participate in this meeting of the Biodefense Blue Ribbon Panel. I'm honored to be here with you today and to share my experiences on the evolving biological threats and the importance of attribution. As the panel is well aware of, naturally occurring and man-made biological threats pose a grave risk to our health and national security. Globalization, population growth, urbanization, and other factors are creating the perfect storm for the emergence of high-consequence infectious diseases. But a terrorism nexus also exists in many of these same global disease hotspots, and together are changing the nature of biological risk. This is exacerbated by the diffusion of technical expertise, coupled with the biotechnology revolution, drastically increasing the threat of bioterrorism. New technologies have decreased resources and financial requirements for entry, and increased capabilities that could be misused by a determined bioterrorist. The panel previously identified the need to strengthen infectious disease surveillance and laboratory capabilities to detect threats early. Similarly, we need core microbial forensic laboratory capabilities to enable attribution. For my part, I've been involved in biodefense since 1982 to the present, from the Cold War to the rise of violent extremism, and now the increasing frequency of emerging infectious diseases with pandemic potential. I feel as though I've been at the eye of the storm, witnessing the evolving biological threats over my career. Today, I'm more concerned than ever about the risk of biological threats, whether from outbreaks, accidents, or attacks, and the need to underpin no regret attribution decisions with a sound scientific foundation in microbial forensics. The anthrax letter attacks marked the first significant act of bioterrorism in the United States. That attack was one of the easiest bioterror attacks to confront, yet the impact was far-reaching. As bad as it was, it could have been much worse had the pathogen involved been a contagious agent, resistant to antibiotics, an unknown pathogen, or delivered in a covert, widespread aerosol attack across multiple jurisdictions. As it was, the anthrax letters shut down the Hart Senate building for 3 months, wreaked havoc on the U.S. postal system, reduced business productivity, cost the nation more than $1 billion, and tragically took the lives of 5 and sickened 17 more. More than 30,000 people required post-exposure antibiotics, and I suspect that several in this room today are now recalling the frightening moments some of us experienced during that time. This event also forever changed our notions of laboratory biosecurity, biosafety, and personal reliability in the biological sciences. And the emerging science of microbial forensics and an understanding of its importance was greatly accelerated. The follow-on FBI Amerithrax investigation applied this emerging science of microbial forensics, and along with traditional investigative procedures, ultimately attributed the attack to a lone U.S. scientist. Attribution to determine who was responsible for an attack, whether a crime, act of terror, or warfare, is essential to hold those responsible accountable for their action, prevent future attacks, and serve as a deterrent. Attribution and the supporting microbial forensic sciences are also important to exonerate and rule out suspected perpetrators, whether a nation state, terror group, or criminal that is innocent. The stakes could be very high, particularly when a nation state is involved or suspected, and a rush to judgment before the science and evidence are in should be avoided. Decisions to attribute, especially a nation state, will be consequential, no-regret decisions that must be guided by strong scientific and evidentiary foundation. It is similarly important to differentiate a naturally occurring infectious disease outbreak from an attack. It may not be readily apparent that an outbreak was natural or due to an intentional cause at the first sign of disease, or even after an outbreak has run its course, whether in people or animals. Prior to 9/11 and the anthrax letter attacks, scientists and operators from the FBI, the CDC, and DoD had already begun establishing needed protocols to enable collaboration to account for public health and law enforcement requirements for sample collection and analysis, and initiated what we now know today as the science of microbial forensics. This same group also began planning for unique laboratory capabilities and the scientists that would be needed to support attribution, whether for an attack, accident, or outbreak, and to uncover and document illicit proliferation activities. Several of those visionary practitioners and pioneers are in this room today or will be with us later today. The facilities envisioned then and soon after the anthrax attacks include the laboratory that was subsequently constructed and in use today at Fort Detrick, the National Biodefense Analysis and Countermeasure Center, or NBAC. I cannot overstate the importance of having dedicated core laboratory capabilities and the scientists that are focused on microbial forensics to support attribution. It is not a part-time job or other duties as assigned function. Microbial forensics is still and will always be an evolving science, perhaps not well understood outside of the relatively few professionals in their field, but prosecutors and national command authorities who will one day be thrust into the position of making no-regret attribution decisions will quickly grasp the importance of microbial forensics as essential to underpinning their pending difficult decisions. The science of microbial forensics will only get more complex with the continued rapid advancement of new biotechnology tools that are readily available. As new science examples evolve of dual-use research concern emerge from our scientific enterprise that could be misused for harm. A recent example is a report by Canadian scientists of the synthesis of horsepox. There was considerable thought that went into the establishment of the NBAC laboratory to support law enforcement and national security attribution. To my knowledge, those original planning assumptions have not substantially changed. I strongly recommend that those strategies and needed capabilities are not abandoned. I will close with two hypothetical but plausible scenarios to consider. The first involves the Korean Peninsula. A hypothetical covert aerosol release of a bioterror pathogen in the Seoul subway. This scenario was explored through the Able Response Exercise series a few years ago in the Republic of Korea. I will leave it to you to consider the potential perpetrators and the importance of attribution to either rule in or rule out suspect criminals, terror groups, or nation states, and the magnitude of no-regret decisions for this scenario. The second is a recent quote from Bill Gates at the Munich Security Summit, where he said, "A genetically engineered virus is easier to make and could kill more people than nuclear weapons. The next epidemic could originate on a computer screen. Whether naturally occurring or bioterror attack, an outbreak could kill tens of millions in the near future unless governments prepare the same way we prepare for war." In terms of attribution, isn't a national security standard the one we apply to maintain and continually evolve our national nuclear attribution capabilities? Should that same national security standard and priority be applied to biological attribution? Given the magnitude of the consequences of the threat and no-regret decisions that will be needed, I believe the answer is yes. Thank you for the opportunity to appear on this panel today. I will be happy to address your questions.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Parker. Mr. Dunaway?
I want to thank the panel for giving me the privilege to speak in today. Asha, thank you very much for arranging for me to speak today. I want to spend my time speaking on a specific issue of which I had direct experience with as a special agent in the FBI. Before I begin, as was mentioned previously, I served as a special agent in the New Jersey division of the FBI, where I worked violent crime, domestic international terrorism, but spent the majority of my time as a WMD investigator in the New Jersey division, focused on biological WMD primarily. While serving in that capacity, I was the lead investigator on a multi-agency HSI FBI multinational investigation involving the use of technology that I had previously been unaware of, that specifically being the convergence of cybersecurity and biological security matters, when specifically the use of the darknet, or dark web as it's sometimes referred, to proliferate biological material. Before I begin getting into the details of that investigation, I'll give a little background on the technology behind the darknet. The primary technology associated with this is called Tor. It was a network protocol and software developed by the U.S. government initially, and then eventually provided to the public for further development. Tor allows users to communicate via web chat and other communication methods, as well as to visit websites anonymously by utilizing a network of devices using the Tor protocols called nodes. In essence, the data traverses from node to node, being layered in encryption, anonymizing further. It's often referred to as the onion router network because it gets layered in layers of encryption like an onion. The net result is when a user goes to the website they're wishing to visit, that website will not see their IP address, will not see identifying information of the user. They're obfuscated. Along with this use, Tor allows for the creation and maintenance of hidden services. And a hidden service is in essence a website or web service that utilizes the Tor network and is only accessible by users who use the Tor protocols. So you couldn't go to a hidden service like you can on the internet, type google.com and go there. It's a gibberish URL, and you can only access these sites if you're using this software. It has built into it this anonymizing nature of the protocol in it. Now, while there's certainly legitimate uses for this software, it was developed by the U.S. government with those in mind, our concern has been with the security issues associated with illicit use of these marketplaces. And there has been numerous marketplaces that have sprung up for those purposes. Most famous, as I'm sure many of you are aware of, is the Silk Road marketplace, which was the subject of a major FBI investigation out of the New York office. These sites, I want to stress for those that haven't been to them, many of these sites are crafted to be very similar to consumer websites like eBay and Amazon. There really are a one-stop shop for purchasing these types of illicit goods and services. Many of them go so far as to have user or seller review portions, just like Amazon, where you could see that this purveyor, it actually has good feedback, so you know that there's somebody you want to purchase for. These sites host sellers willing to anonymously provide narcotics, stolen goods, cyber malware, hacking services and identity theft services, including corporate espionage and sabotage services, weapons, and as was the subject of the investigation I led, but deadly biological materials. Now, my investigation focused on a specific marketplace, now defunct, titled Black Market Reloaded. We were focused on a specific seller who was purporting to provide ricin and abrin to those that would purchase it. And this seller, went so far as to provide instructions to their customers on how to tailor the material to kill their victim. Most worryingly to us, as we became aware of this individual, there appeared to be indications through those seller reviews that they had already sold material online. And so we were really up against the clock trying to find this individual and apprehend them. Now, while there's certainly attempts by the government, and there was in our case, to achieve technical solutions for attribution and identification of individuals using these types of technologies, there are factors that, in my experience, often make the use of those technical means unusable if they exist at all. I'll mention those in my parting thoughts, but suffice to say, technical solutions were not the resolution for our investigation. It was traditional, old-fashioned investigations, including undercover operations. Our big break didn't come from any sophisticated operation, in fact, but quite frankly, it came when our subject made a mistake, as is often the case. As I often said, all the preparation in the world cannot compare to when your subject of your investigation does something stupid. And as we all are aware, it's sometimes better to be lucky than good, and in our case, I think it was a little bit of both. Nevertheless, we were able to identify the individual, and once we did so, we were able to apprehend, arrest, and through their cooperation subsequent to arrest, interdict all of the toxins that were sold, and there were many sold after, prior to our involvement, but fortunately we were able to interdict those, and with partnership with our international law enforcement agencies, we're able to facilitate several arrests of individuals who had purchased the material with intent to commit harm, including one individual was attempting to commit murder. Our subject subsequently was convicted and is serving a 9-year sentence. So I'd like to part with you with just a few points that I take with me from that experience. First, as I had mentioned, while there is and should be efforts by the U.S. government to achieve technical solutions to attribution and identification of individuals using these types of technologies, in my experience, these solutions will generally be classified and maintained for the highest level of national security matters. This leaves a gap for non-national security issues that I believe needs to be addressed, that is currently not being done to the level that it should be. Second, and as I think everybody here is well aware, if there's money to be made from a type of activity, somebody's going to do it. As the U.S. government and many other governments identify and take down these sites, as was done with Silk Road does not exist now. Black Market Reloaded was taken down after our investigation, as well as several others. Quite simply, another site just comes up. Just yesterday, in refreshing my research for this presentation, I was within 15 minutes of surfing the darknet, able to find numerous sites purporting to sell the types of materials we're talking about. So this whack-a-mole approach cannot be the only approach that we take. There needs to be developed additional methods and concepts on how to tackle this issue. And lastly, I want to end with a question that I get often when I present this type of information. I received it often when presenting to FBI management at headquarters. What keeps you up at night? That was the number one question I was asked. What keeps me up at night is not the types of individuals that we identified in this investigation. The people that keep me up at night are those that don't make mistakes. The people that are disciplined, that understand the technology, cyber technology and biological technology, and that would look to use it to cause harm to others, or in the case of our investigation, to make money off those that would. As we continue to see the convergence of cybersecurity and just cyber matters, along with biological security matters, with genetic engineering, synthetic biology, biotechnology, they are converging into one spot. I believe that by identifying lessons learned from the cyber security realms over the last many decades, we can jumpstart many of the principles that will aid our addressing what we're calling cyber biosecurity. To that end, myself and my team at Inspirion Biosciences are partnering with Dr. Randy Murch, who I know is speaking later in the day, and several others to begin development of an initiative to develop this principle of cyber biosecurity so that we can begin formalizing this approach. I want to thank the panel for your time, and I'll be happy to answer any other questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Agent Yu.
So good morning. I would like to thank the distinguished panel and the staff members for the invitation. It's a privilege to be here before you all. And I have the advantage of going last, so I've been set up very nicely. So very quickly, I'm part of the Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate within the FBI, and as was mentioned, it was born out of the events of 9/11 and the anthrax mailings. And as I was already mentioned, the true cornerstone of the program to support our mission in looking at prevention, detection, and response in countering WMDs is actually a specific position within the FBI called the Weapons of Mass Destruction Coordinator, the WMD Coordinator. So for your understanding, these are special agents, men and women that are trained in chemical, biological, and radiological and nuclear matters. The force is that there's at least one stationed in each of our 56 field offices across the U.S. We also have some stationed internationally. And the important part they play is they're a linchpin in establishing partnerships and relationships with state and local law enforcement, with public health. And so that on the front end, they have these notification procedures in place. And so as was mentioned, the challenge is that if there ever was an incident, an unusual outbreak of some kind, then you have law enforcement facilitating in real time communications with public health to determine rapidly, is this a naturally occurring event or is this intentional? So these were born out of the lessons learned from the anthrax investigations and formed very important partnerships with public health through the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And I also like to note that we launched a similar version for the animal and plant health investigations and worked with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Bear in mind, bio is not just human health, but we're also looking at the animal and plant aspects too, which also has huge economic impact and may pose a national security aspect as well too. As I was also mentioned, biotechnology is taking us to some very powerful places now. We're able to synthesize, manufacture DNA very efficiently, and you mentioned the 1918 Spanish flu, the influenza virus. Theoretically speaking, you can order and have that virus synthesized, the genetics of it, for less than $1,000 today. So inordinate leaps in capabilities with the dramatic drops in cost as well too. But here is where the important part of the program, the WMD Coordinator plays as well, is that they are a force multiplier in actually reaching out to some of the sectors that are delving into this biotech space, ranging from universities and companies all the way down to the garage biohackers, the do-it-yourself bio community. The goal is to raise their level of situational awareness, security awareness, so that if on the front end, as Mr. Dunaway mentioned, there's a misstep or identification of suspicious activity, then who better to identify that than the community members themselves for potential misuse, abuse, or exploitation of the technologies out there, and then have an identified body, the WMD Coordinator program, to report that. So it gives us a more lead time in identifying suspicious activities and making sure that the subsequent response is commensurate. I also want to take this opportunity to expand, that's the current state of play and where the future lies too. I'm going to let my colleague from the laboratory division, Doug Anders, who will be speaking later today, to focus on the forensics and attribution. But it was already alluded that we are looking at a specific convergence in the life sciences where we're looking at computer science, engineering, these different applications all becoming multidisciplinary in its effect. And if you look at the myriad of applications that are coming through, there's one thing that's in common, is that they're all very much going to be data dependent. And a clear-cut example of that is the Precision Medicine Initiative that you may be familiar with. It really is leveraging your health history, your family history, your genetics, and combining that together to determine what your current medical state would be, or if you fall into a disease state, how do you tailor the treatments for that, and whether it be designing medications and things of that nature. That's the wave of the future. It's going to be developing all that information, generating it, and then coming up with the proper therapeutics. That's going to be the name of the game. The problem here, though, is that, again, it's very important that we have biodefense focusing, and historically has always been on the dangerous viruses, bacteria, and toxins. But where the cyber realm is taking us, we've rendered ourselves vulnerable to this other aspect. So what do I mean by that? A good example is there is a Chinese-based DNA sequencing company that has met all the US regulations required for compliance when it comes to privacy. But as a result of that, the entire state of California is looking at outsourcing genetic testing to this Chinese firm. So from a privacy standpoint, it makes sense, but I would assume that you would look at, on the face value, the security implications are problematic. And this is happening across the board. But for our lack of vision, we're not understanding what the data that we're looking at today, whether it be the OPM hacks, or looking at the health insurance intrusions, or looking at who we are contracting or partnering with to outsource the genetic testing, among other things. We're not looking at that. We're also not looking at the fact that there are foreign actors, companies that are actually coming into the U.S. and buying, purchasing, outright acquiring companies that have taps into U.S. persons' health information or medical history or genetic information. So we don't know how much we're hemorrhaging, how much of our data is being exfiltrated internationally. So the challenge is that because we've been so focused on one element, which is very important, and the panel has been focused on that, but the challenge for us is that how do we expand the aperture on what we determine to be a biological threat? Our program partnered with the National Academy of Sciences, and we hosted a series of workshops where we brought in experts from the cyber field as well as the biofield to look at what this future looks like. And some of the comments from the expert participants were, we don't know how bad this is going to be for us. And as it stands right now, there is no single point in the U.S. government that looks at biosecurity or this future bioeconomy and what the security implications are. Because if you think about it, the nightmare scenario is that if an actor like China is acquiring all this information about us at a population scale, then, and I apologize for the crassness of this, but the security consideration here is not just the weapon aspects of it, but we may end up becoming healthcare crack addicts, and China becomes our pusher, or some other actor internationally becomes, we become completely dependent upon them for the very things that the panel's been trying to address as far as solutions are concerned. So does that in of itself become a vulnerability? So there's one angle. And the other recommendation is that all of our infrastructure as it's set up right now, it is almost a Cold War era aspect where we're looking at specific biological weapons. Whereas if you look at the bioeconomy standpoint, it's not just a health angle, but it's looking at the U.S.'s economic standing. How does this impact our foreign relations? How does this impact our existing trade agreements, where everything is focused on finished intellectual property or licensed products, where the data is therapeutics or drugs that have not yet been realized yet. So it's really a short-sightedness in this angle. And also to kind of put it into contrast, President Obama, the Obama administration, launched the Precision Medicine Initiative, where we're trying to acquire massive amounts of data and then come up with novel approaches for treatment. When that was launched, the initial capital investment was $215 million. As of last year, the Chinese have launched through their 13th five-year strategy, their own National Precision Medicine Initiative, coupled with their own Big Data Analytics High Performance Computing Initiative, and their initial investment, $9.2 billion over the next 15 years. So they obviously see strategically how this can set them ahead of us. And for your purposes, asking that we broaden the security scope on what we consider biodefense. What we're concerning is it's not only just the health aspects of it, from how this potentially can augment an adversary's defensive capabilities, offensive capabilities, but now we're looking at, is the U.S. going to become marginalized on the global economic stage? Does this translate into loss of our ability to stay leaders in the innovation space, as well as looking at how this impacts us from a national security globally and from a strategic standpoint? So wanted to take this opportunity to kind of expand that and open to some questions. But again, thank you for this opportunity.
Fascinating, and you did expand it, and much food for thought. I'll go ahead and start off with a couple questions, and then turn it over to my fellow panel members. First, Mr. Dunaway, just want to ask you about the investigation that you described. I'm a cop show aficionado, so I just couldn't leave this hanging. You said you caught the bad guy because the bad guy made a mistake. Can you tell us what that mistake was? I'm just dying of curiosity.
Sure. Unbelievably Well, let me pulling back to how we started with this individual was making direct contact through undercover operations. Without going into the specifics of those operations, what I can tell you is, to all of our surprise, our very talented undercover operator was able to convince the subject to take a photo of themselves with a newspaper, circling it, which made it possible for us to, with a highlighter, which made it possible for us to recover it as evidence, and send it to us as proof of their bona fides. This gave us the physical location, of course, and as I mentioned, gave us evidence to corroborate once we arrested and searched their residence. So, without going into more specifics, it was pretty much. It was a shot that we didn't think was going to work.
And it worked.
But it did. Yeah.
Great undercover work. Good. Okay, Dr. Parker, just want to ask you, so in terms of the biological agents that are out there sort of being trafficked about and being offered on the dark web, Mr. Darley talked about, and otherwise, do you have a sense of how much of this is maybe left over from nation-state stockpiles? How much of this is otherwise, created otherwise? Do you have a sense of that?
Well, if I rewind the clock, back to the, say, mid-90s and even the early 2000s, I think that, may have been a concern. I think the fact that microbes are found in nature, they're all over the world. I really, I give less credence that, we're still dealing with, say, stockpiles from the former Soviet Union. They're just readily available, now can be synthesized. Even some of the lists that we have as priority agents. Now, I still think there are a few that on those lists that we better pay attention to and make sure we have everything in our toolkit to prepare, such as anthrax. But lists almost make no sense today, and that makes our job even harder. So I'm not quite as concerned about that, but there are still 5 countries that the Department of State believes retain some type of illicit biological weapons activity. They do include China, Russia, North Korea, Syria. So we still have to be concerned about that proliferation risk. But there are other risks we need to worry about too.
Well, to all three of you, let me just say how appreciative I am and we are of your enormous contribution to this effort and your insights and your wisdom today. Let me just go back to a pretty basic question that I would have based on my own personal experience. If the anthrax attack were to occur again, God forbid, today, what difference would we see in forensics and in the overall capacity for us to investigate and find some degree of confidence in attribution, given the extraordinary difficulty we had the first time?
I probably should yield to my FBI colleague, I think, to start that, and I will jump in. Ed, is that fair?
So as I said, we have Doug Anderson from the Laboratory Division later today to talk a little bit more about the technical aspects. But I can say that since the anthrax mailings, there have been case studies where that real-time communication that I mentioned before was critical. A good example was there was an instance where an individual showed up in the emergency room with inhalational anthrax, and that is from a health standpoint, that is really rare. And so that set off red flags. The appropriate public authority, health authorities were notified, but at the same time, there was a concurrent notification to the FBI, that WD coordinator program. So there was that really important real-time communication between public health and law enforcement to determine rapidly, was this an indication of an intentional release of some kind, or was this a freak issue? And it turned out in that instance, it really was a freak issue. It turned out to be a performing artist who was scraping animal hides from Africa to make drum sets. And as Dr. Parker mentioned, anthracis is found in nature, and the spores were just part of the hide. But it does show how important that timely notification and the sharing information between law enforcement and public health was key in that incident.
And Ed brings up a very good example of the drummer and the hides and so forth. But you may recall in the initial some of the initial reports in 2001 with anthrax, some of the initial reports were even believed that it might have been natural. And I think, many of us in the national security community, thought immediately this can't be natural, but it's hard. You have to do the proper investigation and have the communication channels to try to differentiate between natural and intentional. But with something like inhalational anthrax, you probably ought to be assuming intentional until otherwise proven. I also want to make a comment about just the science of microbial forensics and how hard it's going to even get as we expand the definition of biodefense. It's a hard science, and the technical difficulties in that science will rely on traditional investigative methods coupled with the science, but we got to keep trying on the hard science. We need a solid sound foundation plus traditional investigative methods to be able to make these decisions. I think some recent discussions about maybe abandoning a laboratory that was built and dedicated for microbial forensics to support attribution. I think those decisions need to really be looked at very, very closely. There was a good reason why decisions were made back then to establish dedicated capabilities and develop the scientific cadre and experience that was focused on microbial forensics in that mindset. It's not a part-time job. It's not something you pull the scientists out of another lab that may be working on vaccine development or diagnostic development to start working on an investigative case. It needs that dedication, and I hope some of those decisions are revisited. And perhaps strengthen the need that we need to have these dedicated core capabilities that can reach out to the broader scientific community across the nation and involve those in universities, industry, and so forth too.
Well, Dr. Parker, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I just want to add to that that in the case of the investigation I mentioned, that reach back capability was integral. It was vital, and that capability that you describe is one that, as a WMD investigator in the field, we relied upon on a nearly daily basis. We were very busy in the New Jersey division, New York, New Jersey. I can attest to the quick response notification for I was serving during the time of that incident, and the ability to reach back to those experts in a rapid manner. I can't think of a worse result for the agents in the field than removing that capability.
Well, I just would want to say with an exclamation point how much I am in full agreement. I think it would be so penny wise and pound foolish, and such a short-sighted decision. I'm very hopeful, like you, that we can address it. Let me just ask one final question. I know we have a lot of wonderful experts here today, but so much of the challenge is scientific and technological, but so much of it is organizational as well. And I would be very interested if you could give us your guidance on organizationally, from at least the federal perspective, how would you address this challenge more effectively? I sense today that so many entities have some responsibility that the essence of it becomes no one has responsibility, and so there's so much of the effort that just doesn't get the kind of priority that it deserves, in part because it doesn't fit in the top 5 for any one particular agency. And to your point earlier, Mr. Dunaway, I'm especially concerned about the degree of gap that you say exists between non-national security and national security, and how we look at that organizationally. So if you could just elaborate a little bit more on the organizational challenges we face, I'd be grateful.
Well, I'll start. I think fundamentally, fundamentally, it does start with leadership at the highest levels, and we've talked about this. It's in our report, the need to have leadership at the highest levels that can give this issue priority. It's been talked about since our report came out, or the Blue Ribbon Panel came out, and 2 years ago now. It's been noted by other reports, and that issue of strong centralized leadership to give this issue priority is essential. Now, I understand that the world today is extremely complex. Our foreign policy has extreme challenges. And so it's difficult for other issues to kind of raise to the top. But unfortunately, we are still here today where we are dealing with the biodefense issue, broadly defined, whether it's a crime, terror act, biological warfare, or an emerging infectious disease. We're still in a reactive posture. I hope we can get beyond just a reactive posture. Now, that has importance also for the issue we're talking about today in attribution. It's not just a public health issue. It should be afforded the same level of priority that we provide to nuclear weapons forensics. The consequences could be worse with a biowarfare attack. And some of the profound decisions that may need to make could be catastrophic if we make the wrong decision.
I want to address the issue of organization first, but then I definitely want to hit on the other point on the classified gaps. But I'm going to say something that I'm not sure that Special Agent Special Agent you will be able to address, and now that I'm no longer in the federal employ, I'm going to say, yes, take this opportunity. I believe that just specifically in the FBI, sufficient resources are not provided to the W&B Directorate in general. In specific, the biological side of the WMD Directorate, I believe, would utilize every penny of resources that's provided to them. I believe there is no end to efficient, good ideas that would be enacted if additional resources were placed. There has been a number of successes, and I'm very proud of the successes in my time in the FBI working with Ed. But I often lamented, as did my partners, in the lack of resources that were provided. That being said, this is obviously a larger issue than just the FBI, and there are some leadership issues that arise out of the multidisciplinary boundaries that exist. However, in the FBI, it's one of the things that I felt was the great strength of the WMD Directorate was that, and it was one of the reasons I enjoyed so much my time as a WMD investigator. I'm a cyber nerd at heart, but I have a biochemistry degree, and I love working in biochemistry. And in this field, I was able to combine them both, along with all the other disciplines, and have a variety of activities. But what I was able to do with Ed as well is see a bigger picture by looking at the multidisciplinary nature of it. It was part of the job in a way that isn't necessarily something that those agents that work solely cyber matters or solely international terrorism or solely domestic terrorism have the opportunity to see, just based upon the nature of the workload. And I believe expanding that with those resources provided would allow for greater inaction of I believe, activity that would help. Now, specifically to the classified nature of these gaps in the technical solutions, I'm not certain that the government by itself is the place to find those solutions. I understand and was a part of deliberations for deciding whether a technical solution would be utilized. I believe an appropriate level of thought is given to those deliberations. There are national security matters that warrant retention of certain techniques, and as was possible through our investigation, we were able to resolve the situation without using them, and I think that is actually a best case scenario. However, I believe the government, rightfully so, is always going to lean towards that perspective, and I believe a partnership, a private-public partnership, is going to be where these gaps are filled. I think the government giving support, either financially or through policy, to allow business to invest the capital necessary and the time necessary to develop these methods, as is beginning to some extent in the purely cyber world, although it's still lacking as we all recently have seen in some of the major breaches that have occurred. I think that's going to be the direction that's going to be fruitful in that area.
Thanks to the three of you. Really excellent testimony. So I presume everybody in the room knows what we're talking about when we talk about the NBAC or NBFAC, the Biological Attribution centers out in Fort Detrick. They were built out of a need, a perceived need, urgent need for exactly this kind of analysis center. The federal government, the taxpayers, spent almost $150 million to build it. It's state-of-the-art. It's getting a lot of use. And now the Trump administration's budget has recommended that essentially it be closed up. Now, this could be, of course, you know, a shot across the bow, the initial budget proposal, but you got to take it seriously. It reminded me, if I may take a variation of my co-chair, Tom Ridge used to say, when he would, in the halcyon days, when he was the first secretary of DHS, and I was the chair of the committee in the Senate, he'd come up and say, we'd say, "How you doing, Mr. Secretary?" He said, "Well, I feel like I'm trying to fly a plane while building it." And he was right. In this case, with defunding these centers in Fort Detrick, it's as if we are trying to take apart a plane that we are asking to be flown to a place of real national security concern. So I hope we can turn it around. Just to make the point, Mr. Hewitt, FBI is a major consumer of the work done at these centers. But what would you do if they were, if this facility was closed up?
Well, as Mr. Dunaway said, it is an important asset as far as helping us on our investigative work. I'll just build off of my prior comments in that we are dealing with bio, and this is a much different realm compared to the chemical and the radiological nuclear realm, where you're dealing with finite materials, a very specific type of expertise that can be regulated. But it's completely different in the biological sciences realm. And Dr. Parker and I served on the policy side of the house when it comes to biosecurity, and and this kind of goes back to the prior government question, that even the MBAC and MBFAC and existing government policies right now are still, if you look at it at the heart, is a very specific list of agents of concern. And in my opening statements, biotech is blowing that wide open. And my nightmare scenario is that there's an almost complete convergence with the cyber realm. And the nightmare is what happens if life sciences have the same type of security issues that we have with cybersecurity today. Then if that's being the case, we're going to need more than ever the type of resources to be able to not only look at the agents, but looking at the signature for, say for example, software coders who design agents, or even now today, as we speak, you can design microbes to produce opioid products. So this goes beyond even the state and non-state actually, looking at criminal enterprise where there's absolutely incentive to leverage these type of biotech expertise. So then now you're looking at supporting potential narcotics, illicit narcotics, and we're already in the throes of an opioid fentanyl epidemic in this country. So along those same lines, that aspect of being able to call back for the analysis to support our ongoing investigations, it's more than just the pathogens and toxins. We're looking at a whole other aspect now too. And it goes back to the public-private partnerships, is that enlisting future software coders to be able to address the spaces, not just the straight-up laboratorians, but much like the life sciences is becoming multidisciplinary in nature, so do our ability to do the analysis and the attribution capabilities. That has to expand as well.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying that the facilities out at Fort Detrick are critically important, but in fact, we need even more than that because of the rapid changes occurring in biotech and the convergence of biotech and cyber.
Yes, sir. So to build off of Secretary Rich's comment, is that not only are we trying to fly the plane when we're building, as we're flying it, we're trying to build it, but now we're trying to reach low Earth orbit.
Yeah.
So
And while we're pulling it apart, yes. Mr. Dunaway, maybe you can help us just briefly try to bring the convergence of biotech and cyber to an example that somebody like me can understand. What do we mean when we say that's happening?
Well, the difficulty with that is, as Ed has said here, to the experts that I told him before, we don't really know what it's going to look like because it's so many potential. The potential is so great that we really can't accurately predict. All I could do is give some examples of some recent events that I think potentially could.
Yeah, that would be helpful. Something that we know is happening now.
So there was recently published some research where a few researchers were able to conduct a hack of a synthesizer of a network system for a I'm going to generalize here, but for a company that produced genetic sequences, as I was referring to, that's a capability that's existed now for well over a decade, and it's getting cheaper and cheaper. It's a commodity, that service at this point. These researchers were able to show that by sending a sequence of a certain type, they were able to affect and compromise the code of the machines and take control of those machines. So instead of the typical hacking attempts that we see now using zero-day exploits of software code purely on the computer systems, they were able to actually use the genetic code to bridge that gap. Now, that was a proof of concept. It wasn't out in the wild, but I think it demonstrates one of the many, many different potential issues that are going to be conducted with cyber and bio. I look at it rather than trying to think of specific examples. I don't even look at the bio side as much. I just look at what's happening in the cyber realms. When I see the Equifax hack, I think of a bio Equifax hack.
Sure.
When I see every time I see a cyber event, I think of analogous bio, and I think that mindset is one that we need to all start taking.
Let me go back to the bad guy we talked about before who made a stupid mistake. To the extent you're able, and I think it might make the threat real, if you're able, what was his motivation? Was he a domestic terrorist, a foreign terrorist, or just a lunatic?
I can go into detail. This information actually is public record.
Okay, good.
The subject, Jesse Korf, is his name. I got to know him fairly well after his arrest. I had many interviews with him over about a year after his apprehension and arrest. Mr. Korf was 18 years old when we arrested him. I think he actually represents an aspect of this that I think is going to increase. That is, individuals that were born of the internet age, they didn't learn it. They were born in this realm. The cyber aspects is not something they had to learn. It's just something they're comfortable with. He certainly was. The use of the dark net and these types of technologies, that was secondhand to him and something he just did as a matter of course. And I believe that's accurate and reflective of that generation. And I don't think that's pejorative. I think that is just a fact. In his case, he was incredibly inquisitive. I think it's one of the saddest stories in my career, actually. He was born to foster homes and passed around when he was very young. Became addicted to several different types of drugs during his very young age. I'd be talking 7 or 8. It was really sad. He never learned a moral compass. He never had public interaction. He lived online. And I don't believe necessarily connected as fully as one would, a well-adjusted individual would connect actions online with their actions in person. I believe that was something that was a factor in his sentencing, and I was in support of that. However, this person was brilliant. He developed his own methods as our reachback showed. The methods he used to extract apin and ricin were effective and were novel. He used rudiment. He did not purchase a DIY lab. He did not have a community lab to do this. He did this in a very low-tech method. It was the selling of it via those dark net marketplaces, which really were the more sophisticated aspects. He understood encryption, using encryption in all his communications, And as I said previously, I think that's going to be more and more common. It's going to be secondhand. For a lot of us, we learned it as we developed. As I did, I learned that young, but wasn't born into it. Many of us, it was something we learned later in life. For these people, it's going to be secondhand. So no, I wouldn't phrase him as a crazy person necessarily. He had mentally issues, certainly, and no domestic or international terrorism goals. He purely was able to make money really easy doing something that he enjoyed. He intellectually enjoyed the challenge of creating these materials and just didn't connect.
That makes it real. Dr. Parker, last question. Over the life of this panel, you've been an ex officio member. You've really helped us enormously, and I'll just say for myself, I've learned a lot. You're an expert in infectious animal diseases, and the intersection of animal diseases with human diseases is really quite remarkable, and I know so much more now than I did before. So we're focused on biological attribution. We're really focused on the bioterrorist attack, for instance. But in the work of our panel, we've operated on a premise, which is that what it takes to deal with bioterrorism is pretty similar to what it takes to deal with an infectious disease epidemic or a pandemic. So I wanted to ask you, what's the connection here? In other words, to what extent does our biological attribution capability actually enable us to do things we otherwise wouldn't be able to do when it comes to essentially recognizing the beginning of an infectious disease pandemic?
Well, first, thank you for your comments, and I've enjoyed working with the panel on these hard issues. Attribution is one of the major components of our overall biodefense strategy, broadly defined, whether it's a natural outbreak, attack, or accident. It's one of the stools, and it's one of the national security stools. I happen to believe that emerging infectious diseases are a national security issue, and they have been recognized as that in some circles. Attribution, our laboratory surveillance networks, our public health laboratories, our military laboratories, our laboratories like NBAC and others that may focus on the attribution component of this, they need to be all connected, and they also need to be connected in a One Health fashion. And One Health is meaning that interface between animals, humans, and the ecosystem they find themselves in. And as I mentioned, we are living in a perfect storm where the emergence of the next pandemic will come, and it's also at that nexus where there's happens to be a terrorist activity. And so they're all related. We have to integrate these components, and it's going to take leadership to do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Ken.
Dr. Parker, if I could just follow up on the dollars and cents issue, which I think is an important issue for us here today, especially given the budget that we've seen. So you made the point that it's not a part-time job doing this attribution work, and I guess so. My question is, I'm a staffer at OMB, or I'm a staffer in appropriations, and I think, okay, do you need a 24/7 around-the-clock capability? Do we really need to pay for that? Given that, I read the newspapers, I hear about the occasional ricin attack, I hear, anthrax was however many years ago. Do we really need that?
We absolutely really need that. I think there's, but I think we have to take a hard look at our budget. Our budget, we are experiencing deficits that we shouldn't be experiencing. But we have to look beyond just the biodefense budget to find where some of these savings are. And we also have to look within the biodefense budget to make sure that we are prioritizing the available resources that we have to the maximum benefit. And so the danger is, yes, somebody operating a spreadsheet in the halls of OMB is going to make a decision that's not in line with the priorities that we need. Again, leadership is going to be an issue to help work these things. We need that national strategy that I think is underway now in the interagency. And I hope attribution is, plus a number of other things that we've recognized as priorities. But we owe it to the American taxpayer, all of us, that the dollars and resources that we have available in whatever program are using to the maximum benefit possible.
I guess I just want to make clear to anybody who's skeptical of that that this isn't something where you're just reacting to the attack of the day, but it's a constant educational process.
And yes, and I also think there's a misconception that we have a laboratory somewhere that's just responding to a bioterror attack that hasn't occurred since 2001. And we're keeping the lab open with the lights running and nothing's happening. That couldn't be further from the truth. Now, I don't have more recent information of that, but when I was directly related, when I was in government, that lab was busy. There are cases happening all the time that the FBI or the intelligence community is taking samples to that laboratory, and samples then get triaged and sent to other scientists across the United States. That laboratory is busy. There are things that happen all the time to rule things out or to rule things in, and to be that subject matter reach back to support either intelligence or FBI or public health. So it's just a misconception that the lab is just waiting for the next attack that hasn't come.
Great, thanks very much. I'd like to turn over to the ex officio members for any questions.
Point that not only does this now transcend the conventional frameworks of security, the whole economic dimension of this has to come into perspective. And at the same time, as contemporary biology begins to map essentially every biological process, the whole issue transcends microorganisms to open up an entire new vista of being able, if you understand the wiring diagrams of any given biological function, that obviously has great import in a beneficent sense in terms of new diagnostics and therapeutics, but the knowledge of that wiring diagram also creates an entire new vulnerability to essentially attack any cell type or function within the body.
Just a small point. I wonder if you would share with us information, not now, but over time, on the Chinese program that you described.
I have more of a simple observation. I'd been thinking of a question before that has to do with the fact that we seem to operate always in the reactive mode and not able to look forward. And I thought that perhaps the example of naturally occurring outbreaks that we've had recently could provide an example as opposed to waiting for an incident to happen. But from my previous federal experience, I felt that exposing vulnerabilities in a public setting was not a good idea. And I find now that you've already identified so many really critical vulnerabilities and needs for the capabilities, for example, at the NBAC, that I think you've already made the compelling case and answered my question before I asked it.
Thank you again for your insights. Trying to respond to the needs of law enforcement, and policy, doctrine, etc. And I think your emphasis on the cyber learn and lessons. My question is, what about the general public and their fear or confusion, as we're seeing tragically now in Las Vegas attack, which is something else, but at the same time, what if? So my question is, what do you think in terms of leadership is needed to deal with the public and the civic society?
Thank you for that question. I think answering that will allow me to address a couple of the points that was just made. I truly do feel that a government-only solution for any of these issues, but specifically the public trust, is not a viable solution. There is, I think there's too large and certainly a significant portion of the public that are not going to be comforted by government information. I just think that's a truth that we have to accept. I certainly experienced that as one of the WMD investigators, WMD coordinators. beyond doing investigations, outreach and liaison, quite frankly, that was the largest percentage of the time spent when for most WMD coordinators, if not in an investigation, is building those bridges. And I had spent many years talking with both public through academic institutions as well as through with companies in our AOR and our area of responsibility. And that's where my opinion on the government-only approach not being viable comes from. I believe a strong partnership in some form being transparent, which I think is part of the issue for the government. There are actual national security matters and needs that keep the government from being able to be transparent. It's just a fact of the mission for what these agencies are doing. I believe if we can develop a transparent private entity, maybe there's some public safety organizations that perhaps can be mimicked, APSA and other safety organizations. I think we need to go a lot farther than what those organizations currently do. But I think if you were to find private entities at Inspirion Biosciences, this is certainly something that we're developing and working very hard. This is one of the reasons we're working with Dr. Randy Murch on the Cyber Biosecurity Initiative, is to try to build a business platform that provides a service, things like offensive security, things like genetic screening, services that a lot of these companies, through my personal experience as a WMD coordinator, would like to do if they were offered, but either through cost or lack of legal requirements are not currently doing. I think if those services were provided, I think that there's a business opportunity there that, if that is coinciding with a transparent public demonstration of what these activities are, I think that just being truthful to the public, actually providing information that they can validate. This is where you bring in, I think, academic institutions that are more used to publishing information. I think it needs to be a partnership for all of these organizations, because the government by themselves are just too hamstrung, I believe, to effectively.
No, thank you for the question. I really appreciate that. I think when I mentioned the role of the WMD coordinators in conducting outreach, I rendered short shrift because it's really nuanced. We've been doing this for a number of years, where we facilitated engagement, as I mentioned, to high-end life sciences community members such as universities, pharmaceutical companies, biotech firms, all the way down to the garage biohackers, the do-it-yourself bio community members. And the power of that is that proactive, not reactive, but proactive engagement is raising the awareness within that citizenry to look out for not just only being more safe in their laboratories, but now understanding that they have a role to play in protecting the life sciences, and they're willing to report now as like a tripwire reporting to the FBI WMD coordinators, because, as I said, there's a specific entity that's trusted now that they can report that to, which then also highlights another challenge, a vulnerability, that the FBI is the only place in law enforcement internationally that has a specific WMD coordinator capacity. So what that means is that through our international engagements, through cooperative threat reduction, we have enabled a lot of trained scientists internationally to be more aware on safety and security issues. But is there a corresponding law enforcement capacity where we're building those bridges between the scientific community with foreign public health, with foreign agricultural services? And what's the equivalent? So, and as you all well aware, bio knows no it doesn't respect boundaries. There is a pandemic. So that is the other aspect that maybe goes beyond the scope of the panel, but I think merits a bullet, that we have this very effective WMD coordinator position with the FBI, but what does that look like with our foreign law enforcement partners, that same core capacity?
Yeah, if I can just maybe add, the Global Health Security Agenda actually includes an action package that gets at the interface of law enforcement and public health, and the need to build those capacities internationally so we can detect an outbreak, fight the microbe overseas before we have to fight it here. And that is, I think, an area worth further exploration. And in this, the budget cut, those things right now are very easy to hit the budget dust floor.
Thanks, Ken. Just a few questions since we have some time. One of the things that we talk about on the panel is that the biological threat has been with us for quite some time. Even when we look at our own history in the United States, it's not like, last year we had an offensive program and then we shut it down. We had it decades ago and we shut it down. But, the point is it was there decades ago and now we're still addressing it. We believe it's really important to get ahead of various threats. And, so here we have the cyber threat, and that's great, but we're already asking, what's the next thing? What's beyond the cyber threat? Because there's going to be something beyond the cyber threat. And perhaps more specifically, we were talking about the dark net, we're talking about dark web. Nick, can you talk a little bit? Can you guess what's the next thing beyond that? Because it already seems a little. If you look at the communications traffic about Tor, even people are already like, let's move on.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I could list a number of other I2P. There's always going to be something new. I think an important lesson before I even give you any guesses, an important lesson from that, and perhaps the most important lesson as it relates to legislation, is that, in my opinion, and I think history has shown us that legislating against technology is a disaster. Attempting to legislate to a specific technology at the moment is bound to fail, because by the time you even start to enact that legislation, the technology has changed in some fundamental way. So I think that was maybe the biggest take-home lesson out of that points you were making there. But I constantly try to keep my ear to the research. I think synthetic biology. Obviously the CRISPR revolution, which is already now another technique that is purported to be more efficient than CRISPR-Cas9, is being published. And what has it been, a year and a half since that really got a lot of traction? I think it was 2013 when we were first talking to some folks about CRISPR and how it was about to just blow out everything. What's going to happen next year? I have no idea. But what I can tell you is I expect genetic engineering to become more targeted, more capable, and I think rather than think about the technology, just consider that it's only going to get more effective and more expansive. And I think in that realm, an area that is worth considering is, as is often asked of me, should we ban certain types of research? Should we allow certain types of research? And in my opinion, I believe these advances, and I generally hate to say this word, but I believe that they're inevitable. And I believe that outright bans on this types of research are only going to serve to take the United States out of leadership in this space, which will have huge national security concerns just purely from an economic standpoint. And if you're not in the field, you're not having an effect on the game. So I would hope that there would be some sort of measured middle ground on those discussions. Certainly, just from the standpoint of human experiments, we've seen a number of countries, including other than China, that are doing embryonic research. I think that horse is out of the cart, out of the house, so to speak. That's one big point. Another, I think, that is potentially there, it's yet to be seen, is the BioBricks movement, the idea of engineering and biology. If that is successful, if that continues to develop, I really do think you can think of engineering principles and think of the possibilities. This is why I said when I think of cyber events, I think of bio events. It's partly because of some of the success. I think of the logic gates, basic parts of transistors being created with biological material. A lot of these things are in the early stages and not necessarily anything more proof of concept. But I tend to be a futurist and think that these things are going to happen. It's a matter of time, and it might be an ebb and flow on how quickly. But accepting that these things are inevitable and working from that perspective rather than trying to stop them, I think is the most important lesson I would say we should take from it.
Okay, thanks. Ed, sorry, Special Agent Yu, sorry. Two questions for you. One is you were talking about the need to perhaps replicate the WMD coordinator type position internationally. Has the FBI had any conversations about that with Interpol and Europol and some of the others?
Yes, so as I mentioned before, we have the WMD coordinator position posted internationally as well too, and the FBI's mission has always been about developing force multipliers, partnerships, and so absolutely we have been engaged with Interpol, with Europol, with our Five Eyes partners as well in their law enforcement. But again, it's a matter of, and it was mentioned, it's scope, in that the biotech realm is moving and expanding so rapidly that it's difficult to just keep up with the things that are already list-based. But now you add on some of the broader technologies that are coming on board, it makes it that much more challenging.
Okay. And we've talked a bit about the bioeconomy and the importance. Given the importance of the bioeconomy, do you believe that at the White House, in addition to the National Security Council, we should be engaging the National Economic Council as well on these issues?
So, absolutely. This is an all hands on deck type of issue. As broad as the biodefense enterprise is, as I mentioned, and I'm sorry if I sound like a broken record now, it is still very much pathogen or toxin focused. But as Dr. Post just mentioned, the fact that where life science is taking us, where it becomes more data centric, and we're just focusing on health, this has implications on additive manufacturing, on alternative and renewable energy, on agriculture, that all bets are off now. It's just it's for lack of a better term, in the life sciences and especially in the data space, we are in the middle of a space race. We are absolutely in the middle of a space race. The only difference is that the Sputnik moment hasn't happened yet, but it will. And we are not set up to determine where is that going to happen, how is that going to happen. And that's also one of the thrusts of why we're doing our outreach, is that if you have an informed citizenry, who best than the experts themselves to determine where the next big thing is going to happen. So from a national security standpoint, from here is for us being somewhat myopic, and not looking at the broader aspects of where life science is taking us. Absolutely, we need the economics aspect of it, the foreign diplomacy aspect, the trade aspects of it, among a wealth of other aspects. But it does go beyond to what I would characterize as the traditional approach to biosecurity and biodefense.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think that winds up our session. Well, thank you so much. This has been tremendously illuminating, sobering. But we very much appreciate it. Appreciate all the time, and we will take a lunch break until about 10 after, quarter after 12. At which time Dr. Paul Keim will be here to speak about Amerithrax 16 years later. All right.
Hey, Ken, if you'll allow me to offer a benediction in my role. It just strikes me as I'm listening to this, two things. One is, as we watch this extraordinary expansion, acceleration of biotechnology capability, which is really one of the defining parts of our age and really doing wonderful things for us. It also reminds us really from the beginning of human history that we, generally speaking, advances have also been taken and used for adverse purposes like war. So going way back to fire, made a big difference in human existence, and you can come up to the telegraph and the steamship and all the rest. So we're dealing with a recurring human problem, but inevitably governments represent and law have to try to intervene to protect people's security. The other thing to say, forgive me for this is coming from our experience. One of the great, this is a microcosm, not so much of this is an example, what we've talked about today, of a general problem our government has today, which is both because of the pervasive gridlock, partisan, ideological rigidity, etc., and to a certain extent because of the related refusal to deal with the budget in a rational way. It's very hard for the federal government of the U.S. to get ahead of problems, as somebody said. We tend to only react when there is a crisis or, God forbid, a catastrophe. And so this is, part of what we're working on here is to try to, in this particular area, which we think really matters to human safety, human lives in America, that to try to be advocates to both the public and private sectors to get ahead of this potential threat, real threat, before we have a crisis or a catastrophe. I hope that doesn't badly affect your appetite during lunch, but those are, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, everybody, I think we're going to go ahead and resume. Okay, folks, we're going to go ahead and have our lunchtime speaker, and folks feel free to step in and out to get drinks, coffee, whatever. It's a pleasure to have Dr. Paul Keim here with us today. Dr. Keim is the Cowden Endowed Chair of Microbiology at Northern Arizona University. He's the Director of Pathogen Genomics at the Transnational Genomics Research Institute, or Translational Genomics Research Institute, and works also at the Los Alamos National Laboratory. He's one of the world's leading researchers in anthrax, and his university houses one of the largest anthrax strain collections in the world. His laboratory was critical in the effort to inform the U.S. government's response to the 2001 anthrax attacks, identifying the strain of anthrax that was used and analyzed as for forensic purposes. And he and I actually just had a sidebar and reminisce a little bit about the days of the anthrax investigation. I was sort of on the periphery of that, and it was a fascinating matter, and most fascinating was dealing with experts like Dr. Keim. So I'm gonna turn it over to Dr. Keim. I'm gonna apologize myself because both Senator Lieberman and I are shuttling it out for a couple obligations. I'll be right back. So please, I apologize for the disruption in advance, but we'd love to hear your thoughts about the anthrax investigation. The floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me. As you've already pointed out, I'm Paul Keim. I'm a college professor, but I'm also work with a nonprofit research institute called TGen, or the Translational Genomics Research Institute, which is primarily a precision medicine and cancer genomics institute headed up by Dr. Jeff Trent, who used to be in charge of the intramural program for the genome, that's the human genome, at the National Institutes of Health. In addition to all that, some people thought I sent the letters. There were a few FBI agents who visited me in October of 2001 and wanted to know where I was. And, you know, I had very good alibis. Luckily, my wife was willing to testify that I was with her. I don't think that was a serious investigation, but they were covering all of their bases because, as you mentioned, my laboratory does house the largest strain collection of Bacillus anthracis and other bacterial pathogens, select agent pathogens in the world. And the reason we do that is because we are very much engaged in microbial forensics. We want to be able to understand the diversity of these organisms and then use that to do attribution as certain cases pop up and go along. I'm the past acting chair of the National Science Advisory Board for Biodefense, and so many of the issues you heard about dual use and synthetic biology I dealt with. I was one of the founding members of that board. I'm not going to talk about that today, though. I think today my mission is to talk about microbial forensics. I'm going to talk about what we did in 2001 in the Amerithrax investigation. I'm going to contrast that with an investigation that we carried out to look at the cholera outbreak in Haiti in 2011. So that's a 10-year gap that I'll be able to contrast, you know, what we could do then and what we can do now. And then I'll also tell you what's in the years since 2011, what we're able to do in this area. So what's the status quo, so to speak. Now, microbial forensics is clearly more than just genetics and genomics. But genomics is my bailiwick, so I'm going to tell you about what I know about, and I'll try to answer questions if you want to talk about elemental analysis or other type of structural analysis and things like that for microbial forensics. But really, my expertise is in genomics, and so I'm going to tell you about what's been going on there over the last 16 years. And maybe in contrast to the first panel, I have a very positive message to send to you. In fact, genomics has moved forward at the speed of light in the last 16 years, and our capabilities are so much greater now than they were 16 years ago. and that we actually have an incredible tool for microbial forensics. Now, again, DNA isn't the only thing involved in microbial forensics, but, you know, modeled after the human identification, the CODIS databases, and really the way that DNA analysis has changed the way the courts look at convicting people. Look at the Innocence Project, for example. You know, DNA is an incredibly powerful tool, and it's really what we modeled our whole program after. Now, it turns out that human identification is easy compared to microbial forensics. In microbial forensics, we have a multitude of organisms, biothreat agents that could be involved in a biocrime. We have different biologies. These organisms act differently. They have different rules. Many of them replicate by what we call clonal processes, which means that you can have a anthrax in California, you can have one in Connecticut, and they would be identical, and they would be very natural. So identity and matching is also problematic sometimes in microbial forensics, and so we need to understand the biology and the evolution, the ecology of these organisms. At heart, as a college professor, I'm really an evolutionary biologist. I use DNA and DNA sequencing as a way to understand how organisms change. And of course, that's central to understanding the science when we get into microbial forensics. So in October of 2001, before you knew what anthrax was, Senator Daschle, I got a phone call from an FBI scientist, maybe the only microbiologist in the FBI who had worked on Bacillus, of course, the organism, the group of organisms that anthrax belongs to. Doug Beecher gave me a call and said there was a very unusual case of anthrax in Florida. And, you know, we don't know where it came from. It could be a natural case. It could be this or that. Of course, coming on the tail end, just in the weeks following 9/11, we were all thinking this is nefarious, but there was really no evidence for that. We didn't know how this individual had gotten the anthrax. You know, he'd been hiking in the woods, he drank water out of a spring. There are all sorts of different competing hypotheses for where he got it. But he was very sick, and he had been diagnosed with pulmonary anthrax, most likely caused by inhalation of spores. So soon after that phone call, the CDC, which is a part of HHS, used a private corporate jet and sent a vial of anthrax to Flagstaff, Arizona. And so that private jet was chartered and sent to Flagstaff, Arizona, which is really in the middle of nowhere. I mean, literally, we have an airport that can barely handle jets right on the edge of the Grand Canyon. But the FBI and the CDC knew who we were and knew that we were engaged in anthrax research because there was a microbial forensic community that had been started maybe 8 years before by a very forward-looking program manager in the intelligence community named Janet Dorrigan. Janet had gone to Los Alamos National Laboratory, had put up the money to pay for taking DNA technology and moving it into this forensic realm. So a very early pioneer in this entire area. The work that we did, again, it had been communicated to the FBI. We had peer publications, and we spoke commonly. There was nothing covert about this. And so the FBI knew who we were, and so hence the small jet that flew to Flagstaff, Arizona. It was actually on a Thursday evening, and I met the plane. I took the vial back to the laboratory, and by the next morning, literally within about 10 hours, we knew that we had a DNA fingerprint. We compared it to our DNA database, and we knew that this matched up with what we call the Ames strain. And it was about 3 hours later that the first victim died. So, you know, as far as the speed of identification of the strain, we could hardly have been faster. And what I'm going to tell you about as far as advanced genomic technologies, some of them are getting a little bit faster. They're certainly getting more precise and giving us a lot more ability to understand outbreaks. But in fact, the speed was there. That was maybe it was certainly one of the most important early pieces of evidence that this was a bioterrorism event. We still didn't know about the letters. We still didn't know how Mr. Stevens acquired the disease. Now, that particular technology was based upon pattern matching. It's very similar to what's used by the FBI and law enforcement today in identifying criminals or sexual assaults. It's a pattern matching which, when you go in front of a jury and you say, I've got a match, and that almost always convicts. In fact, it's very common for trials to go forward with nothing but DNA evidence and human identification, but it just doesn't have the same weight when it comes to microbial forensics. In fact, while we reported to multiple U.S. government agencies on that Friday morning that it was the Ames strain, in fact, it also matched another strain. It matched a strain that had come from a natural case of anthrax in Texas, a strain that we call the Texas goat strain from 1997. And so very quickly, once that conclusion had been reached, and I had communicated that to the federal government, and in this case it was through the HHS, it was through the Department of Justice, and also through the intelligence community, that result became the takeaway message, and that was communicated all the way to the highest realms of the government, that we had a match, and it was the Ames strain. Now, as an investigative tool, as an investigative conclusion, that was very important. I mean, it really did lead us in the right direction, but if we'd had to take that into court and defend that in a Fry hearing or a Daubert hearing against an adversarial system, it wouldn't have stood up. And so for the next 2 or 3 years, we continued to investigate Bacillus anthracis. We developed more extensive genomic tools. We started doing whole genome sequencing, and we went out into nature and we sampled more isolates of Bacillus anthracis that were particularly relevant to the Ames strain, and these were from Texas, South Texas, which is where the Ames strain originated. And so over the next 2 or 3 years, we built a very solid case that would have stood up in court. Never did, but if we'd had to gone to court, I'm very confident that we would have, in fact, been able to get past the Fry and Daubert criteria. We would have been allowed to present that this was the Ames strain. It was a laboratory strain, and hence it was something that came out of a laboratory, not something from nature. So sometimes in microbial forensics, you have investigative leads, and you have to run with those. And then when it comes time to go into court, you've got to go back and you've got to develop those in more detail. Now in 2011, well actually in 2010, there was an earthquake in Haiti. And that earthquake was followed about 8 months later by a massive outbreak of cholera. And that cholera outbreak has now killed about 10,000 people and caused almost 1 million cases of cholera. And at the time, many people were saying, well, this is what happens when you have an earthquake in a third world country. The cholera rises, you get diseases that take off. But there's a French epidemiological team that had been doing classical space-time analysis, looking at how the disease had progressed across the area. And they said, whoa, this looks like this started in one particular place, and it was affiliated with a UN peacekeeping mission that had come out of Nepal. And this was not greeted well by the UN, and as you might imagine. And so there was a lot of controversy, and this French epidemiological team got beat up pretty badly by people saying, no, this just can't be the case. Well, we had an international collaboration with the Danes at the Danish Technical Institute, who had a very good connection with the Ministry of Health in Nepal, and so we went and got isolates of Vibrio cholera from Nepal, and we did whole genome sequencing. And we were able to identify that, in fact, that the cholera that was ravaging Haiti was, in fact, very closely affiliated with one particular type that come from the country of Nepal. Now, in this case, instead of, we were able to do this whole genome sequencing, and we'd made a leap forward in technology so that we were able to use whole genome sequencing to identify the strain and then to place it into the context, into a population genetic context that was critical for understanding what it meant. You have to have that context, just like in the sexual assault human identification cases. You've got to have that database to make sense over a DNA fingerprint pattern. You need to have that database to understand it. And we had that because genome technology advanced so far and was so cheap that we were able to do that in a very timely fashion. And as a consequence, it's widely accepted now, and the UN has even accepted a responsibility for that. So that attribution was based upon whole genome sequencing. We had never worked with cholera before. The cholera databases were out there. There were whole genome sequences. There became an international movement to sequence more strains of cholera. We didn't trade live strains. We traded data over the internet through public databases. And so we really reached a new era where whole genome sequences could be traded electronically. The barriers that have arisen over the last couple of decades for exchanging live pathogens even across the United States, we can't do that, let alone across international borders. But electronic databases and genomes are readily exchanged. And so we never even sequenced a strain from Haiti. Rather, we used the data that had been generated by the Centers for Disease Control. So we go from a simple pattern matching in 2001 to 2011. We're doing whole genome sequencing, and we're putting that in large electronic databases. Another aspect to these whole genome sequencing is we now understand the evolution of these genomes in such a way that we can put a real timestamp on it. It's what we call a molecular clock. And so in the case of the Haitian outbreak, we were able to say that the Haitian cholera had an ancestor that lived in Nepal about 6 months before. And so this type of analysis wasn't possible in the pre-genomics era that we were in 2001. But now we can actually put real time, and we can put confidence intervals around that. These types of studies are being done regularly. We routinely will do, 4,000 or 5,000 genome studies in my laboratory. The FDA, which is one of the most advanced forensic tracking groups in the world, now has databases on the order of 100 to 130,000 different foodborne pathogens like E. coli and Salmonella. And so this is so routine, and the methodologies are so great. If we would have another anthrax outbreak, or you name it, you name the pathogen, synthetic or natural, we would be able to tackle that with genomics in a way that would be unbelievable. We would be able to put that in the context over time, and we'd be able to put a timestamp on it. Now, the problems that we have there clearly have to do with creating the databases, the population genetic databases, because in the last 10 years, the ability to transfer pathogens and the ability to even store pathogens has become much more onerous. And because of that, that is the limiting factor, is building the databases to understand the context of an outbreak. Now, you can do some of that ahead of time, but a lot of that has to be done reactive to what the situation is. I mean, we're dealing with rare events here. These are not things that happen, 100 or 20,000 times a year like we have with Salmonella and foodborne pathogens. These are things that are very rare. We have a multitude of agents. We don't know which one's going to be used next. We can rank them. We have our lists, and we can prepare for that. But the reality is we don't know what it's going to be. And even when we do know, for example, that it's going to be anthrax, we didn't know it was going to be from Texas. Who would have guessed? Texas, right? And so building those databases is very important. Now, that's where we were 10, 11 years ago. I mean, we're still doing that type of analysis. But the future is actually, it isn't that we're going to forget and stop doing that, but we also have other advances. As the genomic technologies have improved more and more, what we see is we can now sequence directly from the evidence. So we could take the microphone, so we could sequence from that. We wouldn't have to grow anthrax off of it. We could sequence off the water. And this is what we call metagenomic analysis, where we don't grow up a pathogen. We just go directly into the environment or directly onto the surface and just generate a whole bunch of sequence and then let the computers sort it out. Now, in the anthrax investigations, one of the most intriguing, in the Amerithrax investigation, one of the most intriguing attempts at evidence related to these morphs. Surely you've heard about the morphs that were present in the different powders. So we call it the Daschle powders. There were, physicians just love to have diseases named after them. If they discover a disease, it becomes Alzheimer's disease, for example. So now we have the Daschle powders. That's okay. We'll save Lieberman for something else. So in the letters, a very astute microbiologist at USAMR named Pat Warsham noticed, in fact, that there were minor variants. So when she plated out the powders, she could see that there was a difference in the way some of the colonies looked when they grew up. She was actually an expert at this. She had published papers on these different morphologies previously, so it wasn't like this was a totally new insight. She knew that most of these morphs were due to mutations that were stable, that changed the way they grew. they're actually an artifact of growing Bacillus anthracis in the laboratory. You don't see them in nature. In nature, these are maladapted things that get selected out by their passages during causing diseases. But in the laboratory, when you're growing up spores, sometimes you're selecting for a biology that's different. So you select for mutants, and these mutants actually have an advantage in the laboratory over the wild type that will actually cause diseases. So she saw these, she kind of knew what they were. They purified them. My laboratory then grew up large amounts of DNA. These were sent to the Institute for Genome Research, which is headed by Claire Fraser, and the work there was done primarily by Jacques Ravel, a very exciting scientist. And what they discovered was that there were mutations that were behind these morphs. They developed assays for those, and then they went back and they screened all the evidence. Now, in this period of time, the FBI had accumulated over 1,000 pieces of evidence from different laboratories, from offices, from environmental samples, and at least one copy of all that evidence was stored in my laboratory for about 6 or 7 years. Now, they screened those, and in doing that, they were able to focus back on a single flask. This is the famous RMR 1029 flask, which had all of the morphs that were seen that had been characterized in the letters. And so what this said was, in fact, that the cultures had heterogeneity, and that heterogeneity could be used as a signature to identify the source. It could be used for attribution. And so this really was a very forward-thinking approach to attribution. Before this, we'd always said, oh, we can only look at the dominant type of the genome that's in a particular colony or a particular prep. In this case, it said, well, look, there's some minor ones in there too, and those minor ones might be a signature that allows us to go back. Now, that research, and I call it research, or that investigational evidence was highly criticized by the National Academy of Sciences study that went back and looked at the Amerithrax investigation. They said you didn't understand the biology, you didn't do the proper controls, you didn't sample the evidence correctly. There's lots of criticisms there, but nevertheless, as an investigational tool, it was very powerful. It would not have held up in court. Clearly, we would have had National Academy members, scientists from across the world lining up to testify against the way that that was used. But today, we could do it differently. We know that this heterogeneity inside of the samples can be used as a signature, and we can use this metagenomic approach where we can go in and sample everything and just sequence it directly. We're able to look at the entire, 5.5 megabases, million bases of DNA, and look at the variation in all those positions and develop a signature for a particular powder, compare that to a particular source. And so that this heterogeneity via metagenomic analysis would be much more powerful. We used this a couple of years ago to sequence the anthrax genomes from Russian victims of the 1979 Sverdlovsk accident. 1979, the Russians had an accident in one of their spore production facilities, killed about 60 people of anthrax. We had gotten formalin-fixed tissues from some of these victims, and we were able to go in and sequence the entire material, 99% of which was the human victim's own DNA, but 1% was the anthrax DNA, and we reconstructed then, in a computer, reconstructed the genome of the Soviet battle strain, which is called 836. So now we know what the Soviets were using. We have in our database, we have a marker for the Soviet biological weapons program. If we ever see that genome again in an event around the world, we'll start thinking, state-sponsored and try to establish this link back to the Soviet program. So very important is this difference between investigational evidence, investigational tools, and those that would be accepted in court. And obviously the court-based genomic analysis has to be much more highly validated, and it's going to be subjected to an adversarial system, whereas investigational tools can be developed much more readily. Now, there's only a few examples of this, and one of those examples I'm going to tell you about of where we've taken genomic data in a microbial investigation to court involved a U.S. District Court case just here in 2017. It's a murder trial. There were 20 counts of second-degree murder, and involved the head of the New England compounding pharmacy. So this is a compounding pharmacies or drug companies, small drug companies that make up drugs. In this case, they're making up batches of steroids, in particular for people who had back pain. But in the process of doing this, they had badly contaminated their steroids with a fungus. And this fungus normally is not pathogenic, it lives in the soil. But when you inject it directly into your spinal fluid with steroids, which inhibit your immune system, voila. So there were over 700 cases of fungal infections associated with these, and on the order of 60 deaths. They were charged with 20 deaths that could be tied to it. Now, what we did, so fungal genomes are more complex than bacterial genomes, which are more complex than viral genomes. So this fungus is a fungus that's called Exocerohilum. I'm sure that doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean much more to you than it means to me. It's a soil bacteria. It's soil fungus. So Exocerohilum, though, has a genome that's about 8 times bigger than the Bacillus anthracis genome. And so that's a significant challenge for genomics. It's not as bad as sequencing the human genome, but it's certainly more of a challenge. So what happened was we sequenced the whole genomes and compared those for isolates of the fungus that came out of victims, people who died, and compared to that to isolates that we found inside of the drugs, the steroids. And when we did that, we found there were almost no differences at all. They were nearly identical with each other. And when we compared that to other isolates, in fact, they were dramatically different. So it really did look like there was a tie. So this evidence, it was pretty meager, actually, by my standards. I've testified a few times for the defense challenging DNA evidence in my day. But in this particular case, I would have had a field day, I think, because we didn't have the population genetics. But nevertheless, it was not challenged by the courts. This is U.S. District Court in Boston. It was not challenged by the defense attorneys, at least not successfully. So that evidence went into court and was part of the evidence that the U.S. Attorney's Office used. So this was in federal court. And so you would expect that, in fact, the Daubert criteria would have been brought in for new science. But it wasn't. So we have an example here where microbial forensic DNA evidence has made it into the courts and was successfully used. Now, the CEO of this company was not convicted of murder, but he was convicted of fraud and racketeering and was sentenced to about 9 years in jail. So, so this difference between investigational and judicial is very important, and it's important that we know what we're looking at when we go into this. Now, I thought I would just finish up with some observations or recommendations. So I have really like 5 recommendations. Some of these we've heard already. Some of these seem so obvious that I don't call them recommendations as much as observations. So first off, in microbial forensics, most of our big advances in genomics were things that were developed in other sciences. We're taking advantage of faster computers, we're taking advantage of better sequencers, and we're putting that into a microbial forensics context. We're not inventing the science, but we're using it. Part of this is we have to be able to use public health investigations of natural disease outbreaks. So we aren't going to get to practice on the next event ahead of time because we don't know what it is. But we can practice upon other public health outbreaks. And so it's important that we look at things, we go and look at disease outbreaks when they occur and learn from that. We have to rely upon the public health infrastructure. You know, we can't build enough microbial forensic laboratories to do this, but we can leverage the public health infrastructure to do it. In the Zerohilum case in the compounding pharmacies, that work was in conjunction with the CDC. This was a Department of Justice investigation as well as the FDA, but they didn't use the NBAC in that case. They used the CDC and they used my laboratory because we're experts in fungal diseases. We have to capitalize upon scientific advances in other fields because we just don't have, other fields are going to move much more quickly than we can in microbial forensics. And so for the last 16 years in genomics, I would say that we were riding the coattails of the human genome and other efforts. And even in the area of public health and molecular epidemiology of foodborne pathogens, we're learning a lot from falling on those. So it's very important to capitalize upon those. Foreign engagement is critical. Most of these diseases that we're really worried about are not active in the United States. For example, right now in Madagascar, there's a major inhalational pulmonary plague outbreak going on there. It's a major public health. We have people there who are interacting with those folks, the Institut Pasteur in Madagascar, and we have folks who are collecting samples, and we're doing that type of analysis so that we learn how to do this for a pathogen that doesn't cause disease very often in the United States. Finally, I'll just echo what I heard this morning, especially from Jerry, that we have to have infrastructure in the United States to do this. The U.S. government has probably 6 or 7 agencies that are involved in microbial forensics: DHS, FDA, CDC, DOJ, Department of Defense, USDA, the intelligence communities. All of those agencies have some capacity in microbial forensics. The INBAC is very important to the Department of Justice and for many of our biodefense things. But it's not one-stop shopping. It's not like everything that has to do with microbial forensics goes through the INBAC, as critical as it is. So it's important to realize that this is a dispersed effort as well as needing that one critical piece. It's kind of like saying, oh, we're going to have a agency that's responsible for computers. Well, everybody has computers. Everybody writes software. And so microbial forensics is going to be in all these different agencies. They all have their own unique mission and aspect of how they use microbial forensics. And so when you talk about leadership, I think what leadership is needed there is coordination, harmonization. It's important that those different agencies and different groups who are all trying to tackle similar problems, but maybe for different purposes, are in fact interacting in a way so that the entire government moves forward. As you know, when you have these different agencies that are doing this, you end up in this situation where you have cooperation, but you also have competition. And the balance between that cooperation and competition across those agencies is something that has to be managed so that it gets the best of both worlds, right? Competition's good, but only as far as it stimulates the entire effort across the government. So there's 5 recommendations. I'll give you those in writing later if you want. Be glad to answer any questions that you might have. Well, Dr. Kem, thank you very much for that outstanding presentation, and more importantly than that even, thank you for all of your good work over these many years, and your leadership and your vision for what could be and can be. Your commitment is just sets a standard and for that we're very grateful. Let me just start by asking a similar question to what I asked the first panel. You, maybe arguably more than anybody else in the country now, can relate to the Amerithax investigation and the improvements in forensics and the extraordinary progress in some ways we've made. But could you contrast in a more specific way that investigation and how one would develop today? What would be the 2 or 3 most significant differences that we would recognize and rely upon were the same situation to occur today? Well, I may start in a place you don't expect, but one of the aspects that's different today than it was in 2001 was public health, law enforcement, and the intelligence community talk to each other. That was not true in 2001. I think I was the only person in the U.S. who was talking to all 3. And that did change. I think there were some very hard times early in the investigation, and clearly, as you said, building the DHS airplane while it was flying was hard, so I think, when we changed government in such a massive way, that was difficult, and that had to sort out. I think we would all be people maybe didn't realize how dysfunctional that situation was in 2001, or maybe you in particular did. But it's a much better place, and we're much better off, and so I think people will be pleased with that. Now, that doesn't say that that task is done. It's a continual process. People are people, and you have to continually keep them cooperating and working together. I think that we would instantly use genomics, and we would use advanced genomic techniques. You know, all these living organisms we're talking about have genomes, and it is a wealth of information, and we have a universal technology that can be applied to all of them. Now, the science between all of those organisms is a little bit different, and it's important to have subject area experts who know that and know how to interpret those patterns and know what the confidence we have in those conclusions. But I think that we would instantly jump in and use advanced genomics. The NBFAC has an excellent genomics team. If it was in their purview, in other words, not a something that was maybe better suited for the military or the intelligence community, it would definitely be going through the NBAC, and I think we would be pleased with the results and the way they handled that analysis. I work with them a lot, so I know their people and I know their capabilities very well. And we could go off on a whole nother tangent about the space station and stuff like that, which is very interesting. I think you know, the traditional approaches to forensics are critical. You know, DNA technology and microbial forensics is going to be a piece of this, but the traditional type of investigative approaches are the backbone of a microbial forensics investigation. You know, if we had gotten a DNA fingerprint, for example, off one of those letters, it would have been an amazing piece of evidence. And with new technologies and genome sequencing, you know, it might be possible to do that. I'm sure the FBI won't agree to this, but I think that some of the that the evidence from the Amerithrax case could be reanalyzed, and we would learn a lot from it. And you know, the reason that the Bureau will not agree to that is because they don't want to resurrect a zombie out of the grave, right? And set the conspiracy theorists loose once again. So I think politically that's not going to happen, but from a technical standpoint, we would learn a lot if we could do that. Well, that's a very good answer. Let me ask you this. With limited resources and obviously a whole array of challenges we face, how would you prioritize where the country needs to make its critical investments now? How do you, as you look at forensics going, say, to the next decade, and you had the magic wand to decide where resources and leadership would be put, how would you characterize the prioritization of that effort?
Yeah, that's a big question, isn't it? And it depends upon how limited. I really believe that law enforcement and public health have to be solid partners in this. And I think, and I don't have the answer to this, but I'll just say that we have to figure out how to make sure that they're engaged partners. You know, it's much better than it was 16 years ago, but it's clear that public health, they don't want to do some of the things that law enforcement want them to do as far as evidence tracking and the way they handle things. And so somehow making sure that the forensics capabilities are engaged in public health. I'm not sure exactly how to put the money or who the leadership should be there, but I think that that's a very important aspect. I think also having the microbial forensics well engaged with traditional forensics. You know, the NBAC is in Detroit, the FBI crime lab is in Quantico, and that's due to the politics related to the U.S. Marine Corps, as I understand it. And if there was a way actually to do that where we had the best of all those worlds, making sure that those were engaged, or taking steps to make sure those are engaged. And the Bureau might actually say that they are, but no doubt it could be better.
You mentioned NBAC a couple of times now, and obviously there's a lot of concern about the future of NBAC and what happens there. Mm-hmm. In your view, if NBAC were to close, would we have the infrastructure, would we have the capacity to deal with the many challenges we're facing without it today?
We would respond partially. I mean, in 2001, we did respond. You know, we took advantage of the Department of Defense's laboratories. A lot of national laboratories stepped forward. The country really did step forward to tackle something that was unexpected. Would they do it as well as in a coordinated fashion as having an NBAC? I would say no. I mean, the country needs that type of infrastructure for those types of events, and
it's not going to it's like I said, it's not one-stop shopping. I mean, we have lots of other U.S. government agencies and state agencies even who are pursuing microbial forensic programs. But for certain types of things, it's really the only place that we have, BSL-4 type forensic analysis under a chain of evidence and in a fashion that we'd be able to take to court.
You mentioned one of somewhat of a surprising aspect to your first answer was that you thought coordination would be better today than it was 16 years ago. Are you satisfied? And NBAC comes to mind as I think of the lack of coordination, the lack of agencies taking responsibility. How would you characterize the overall level of coordination and cooperation today?
Give me a specific, like between the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security, or?
Well, just as it deals with forensics, let's say. And
Yeah.
then the degree to which you think cooperation and coordination is necessary. Are we meeting the necessary standard by which you think we can do it effectively?
We're moving there, and I'll step aside from the NBAC and talk about the FDA and the CDC for just a second. So those two agencies actually have overlapping missions. The CDC is responsible for foodborne outbreaks if you have it. The FDA is responsible for it if it's in the food. Okay, so they both are trying to track microbes that are causing disease and to attribute those. And in some cases, those go to court or at least go to a settlement where major corporations have major losses. So that really is a microbial forensics. I would say that there was a turf war that existed until recently, and that in fact the FDA provided the ultimate leadership to move forward in this area of genomic tracking. Some very insightful people there set up a microbial tracking system, moved it forward. We're very careful not to step on the CDC's toes. And now the CDC is on board and doing it too. Okay, so it really took almost some shaming, frankly. For maybe 15 years, I had been trying to get the CDC to take up advanced genomic technology for tracking their diseases. It was the FDA who finally got them to do that. So there's an example where now they're totally cooperating. They're using the same data sets. They're using the National Center for Bioinformatic Information, which is part of NIH, as a repository for that. And so there is excellent cooperation and collaboration there. It wasn't easy. And so I'm sure there's not a magic wand for this. It's going to take leadership, and it's going to take leaders who try to motivate and work across these silos in government. I explain the U.S. government to foreigners. I say, well, we really don't have one government. We've got all these agencies, and each one is bigger than your government, and they kind of act like that, So it takes some really enlightened and selfless people to make that happen.
Last question. The degree to which we focus on anthrax is certainly understandable. There are some who argue that some agencies focus too exclusively on anthrax, and as we look at the microbial forensics and the need and the broad issues that are out there, that we really ought to broaden our focus some. To what extent are we too focused on anthrax at the expense of others?
Well, I don't think that we're certainly anthrax isn't the only thing we look at, and the priority lists are set up based upon risk assessment. We know that those are not perfect, but they're really the best that we have. In one sense, doing it really well on a small number of high-risk pathogens prepares us for jumping to the unknown. I mean, the unknown is massive. We're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of potential problem agents out there. There's no way that we can cover all of them. We need to cover ones that are different from each other, ones that are involved with airborne, that are vector, that are water, that are food. We need to have examples of all of those in our experience, in our legacy, in order to be prepared for the unknown. And maybe it will, in fact, be anthrax again, or plague, or tularemia, or smallpox. And those are ones that we are working very actively on. So it isn't the probability that's going to be anthrax is less than 10%. But what's number two? Well, it may be 5%. And so you just go on and on. You still have to work off of that risk assessment, but definitely not a single agent.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kine.
Thanks, Doctor. You've taken me into what we used to call a brave new world. So I just got a few questions. Tell me, well, I'm going to go back to what you said about the increasing interagency cooperation. Why do you think that's so? What happened in between 2001 and now?
I think it was patriotism. I think people actually realized that they had to get past their petty little fights and do something good for the country.
That's a great answer. I didn't expect it, but I'm inspired by it. And you're a man of science, so I believe you're right. So it's said based on observation. So for a genuine layperson like myself, what are the practical consequences significant of this increased capacity you have to do some of the things you've described, genomic sequencing, etc.? Does it just help in the area we're talking about with attribution? Does it enable us to develop more easily, I hesitate to use the word, but medical countermeasures, for instance? What's the significance of it?
Yeah, I mean, the genomic analyses move over into diagnostics immediately. So my institute, I'm an executive director of an institute, probably 70% of it focuses upon diagnostic of common diseases. We use these same methodologies to track C. difficile infections in hospitals. Flesh-eating bacteria, group A strep, we spotted clusters of those, all of those with the goal of identifying the source and then eliminating that. So this ability is actually not being driven by microbial forensics. In 2001 to 2005, we had a lot of money and we had a lot of motivation to sequence genomes in a way that nobody had ever done. In that time period, we were the cutting edge. In anthrax research with the Institute for Genome Research and then the analyses we were doing, nobody was doing it better in the world. That's not true anymore. We're followers now. I mean, the places where these major breakthroughs are occurring are in foodborne pathogens. I would say the Ebola virus outbreak was an amazing demonstration of the way you can deploy genomics into a theater or into real time. And so
who did it then?
That was interesting. I will say that I think that the Brits are better at this than we are. And I think that they've deployed it in their public health system sooner. They're better at genomics. They have this little instrument that we call the MinION out of Oxford Nanopore. A lot of the sequencing technology that we have was matured in the United States, but in fact it was developed in England. And so they also, this is a sad statement for our educational system, but they're mathematically more gifted than we are. We have more people who understand math and are able to do sophisticated modeling. And that's been very important in moving this science forward. And so the Brits were there, the U.S. Army was there, we had other folks in theater using these same instruments. And so it was actually a great demonstration of how you can move genomics right to the edge of an outbreak.
So what did it enable us to do in the Ebola outbreak?
Well, it allowed us to track it. In other words, one of the ways you control an outbreak like that is by traceback, so that you can go back and look and find where it is, find out who somebody who is spreading Ebola virus, who they had contact with. This type of analysis allows you to go back. They now have gone back almost to the very tree where the original Ebola jumped from the bat over into people. So this type of precision allows us to understand that outbreak, allows us to understand why this Ebola outbreak was considerably different than the previous ones. I would say that we didn't think Ebola was all that dangerous because it always killed people so fast that it burned itself out. Well, that didn't happen in this case. It took off and spread in a way that we hadn't anticipated, and now we're able to go back and reconstruct that using these molecular epidemiological tools.
Thank you.
So one other thing is
Yeah.
these genomics are allowing us to develop better vaccines. They're allowing us to identify particular targets. We have a very active program in this with the Defense Threat Reduction Agency using genomics to enable vaccine production. It's also allowing us to identify targets for drugs. And so the genomics, it's not just one genome anymore. We'll sequence 1,000 genomes, look for the common targets, and be able to use those. So yeah, very important for countermeasures.
That's great. Great to hear. Thank you. Thanks for your work, which is also, I would say, an act of patriotism.
I just have one follow-up. I was just intrigued. You said that Ebola was, this strain of Ebola, or previous strains of Ebola, kill people so fast that it burned itself out. You mean people died before they had enough human interaction to pass it to others? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I didn't mean to say that it was the strain of Ebola, but the circumstances of the outbreak. And so, investigators would walk into a village in the jungle and everybody be dead. And that had happened in such a way that people died so fast that, in fact, they hadn't had a chance to disperse. Whereas in this outbreak, people moved, and some got to Dallas, Texas, and so people moved, and as it started to move, then that meant that you didn't self-contain in the outbreak, and so the mortality and morbidity associated with this outbreak was conceivable, but hadn't been observed before.
Got it. Okay. Anything else?
So, Paul, I want to go back to the statement you made about focusing on the list of agents prepares us for the unknown. And there are some who would feel that sticking with the list actually can lull us into a false sense of security, And then thinking about what the panel this morning told us about the advances in science and technology, how would you feel comparing those two views with the idea of sticking with the list?
Well, lists are dangerous, and especially policymakers don't understand that the list is just a risk assessment, and it's used for a couple of purposes. Lists are used to guide funding, and they're used for regulatory compliance. And all of those who live in that world realize how ridiculous that is, right? Because we know that salmonella was used as a biological weapon before anthrax was, and how effective that was. And so, lists are dangerous, and I totally appreciate that you need to be careful and recognize that those lists are not comprehensive. So in that case, I totally agree. But on the other hand, you can't do everything, and so at some point, you're going to have to make policy management and risk assessments that tell you to focus upon some things first, and that's where these lists can be valuable. And I would come back and say anthrax is very dangerous. Do not forget about anthrax, because it's a terrible biological weapon for lots of reasons. And we got off, as Jerry said this morning. I can tell you just a couple of things that would have made this letter attack so much more effective, where hundreds or thousands of people would have died. And we can all see that. We can just see that it wasn't as effective as it could have been from a mortality. And yet, as Jerry pointed out, the impact as a terrorist weapon was immense. I mean, it changed this country in ways that we're still trying to figure out, major ways. I think lists are dangerous, but they're almost a necessary evil that we have to deal with. I don't like the way that the lists are constructed now, in the sense there's this secret federal committee that gets together and decides what's on the list and what isn't. The argument is, well, there's security considerations. We can't have an open debate about this. But nevertheless, the list is what it is, and in a sense, it's like training wheels. We're learning how to do this, and so we can prepare for the next event.
So Paul, as always, a very eloquent summary of a complex subject, and I think for the panel at large, this whole issue of metagenomics has enormous forensic implications even beyond biodefense. We know that every bug that lives in a Superfund site adapts to the chemicals which are in the soil, so you have a fingerprint of that. Monitoring bilge discharges from ships enables us to track which microorganisms are being released out of ships in different ports, and therefore capacity. But I think the fundamental issue, as you said, is the fact that attribution does actually merge with diagnosis and prevention, because I think if Agent X, the infamous Agent X, does come at us, the ability to be able to sequence a genome and increasingly with predictive accuracy identify the likely coding regions for the most immunogenic proteins, and then identification of the epitopes within that particular protein does actually offer the opportunity to completely diversify the vaccine production base by moving us from a biological production process to chemical synthesis of epitopes, which would not only diversify the manufacturing base available, because right now we, even under the best of circumstances, we could probably produce several 100,000, perhaps several thousands of millions, but not a billion vaccine doses of any known pathogen for a population which is much larger. But if we could chemically synthesize those epitopes, and I think that's another frontier that we're going to have to look hard at, and I know that DITRA is also looking at that with you.
Yeah, there's so many other technologies that are coming on. I mean, genomics is becoming routine. It's like having an iPhone, and so because of that, then it's going to impact all aspects of what we're talking about. Vaccine development, therapeutics development, molecular epidemiology, diagnostics, environmental monitoring, all that's going to be changed as we go further down this pathway, because genomics doesn't look like it's slowing down, or if it's slowing down, it's not slowing down much.
If there is a time to ask one question, to come back to your point about engaged partnerships, the need for that. Can you comment on the need for engaged partnership in this area on the international level? I think you referred to the example of the anthrax in Russia in 1979, and then we have many examples going all the way back to the 30s in Manchuria, for example, with the prisoners who were also infected and so forth. So my question basically is there a roadmap in terms of engagement with the international community, such as Russia, Japan, China, and so forth?
The U.S. government has made a number of attempts to engage foreign governments. The CBAP program at DITRA is an example. But the Department of Homeland Security also has had an international office. I guess if I was going to make a specific recommendation here, why don't we treat international engagement like we do SBIR grants? So in other words, you have to put 2% of your budget into an international collaboration. I can tell you the best people in the world for understanding tularemia are the Swedes. Okay, absolutely the best. The best place to study plague in humans is Madagascar. We have to reach out to those people if we're going to be engaged in those particular diseases. And, it's kind of a patchwork that is not well coordinated and not well motivated, in my opinion, and we need more of that. I think that, especially in the case of DITRA, they have definitely political goals as well as the scientific goals. The country of Georgia has a very big U.S. presence because of DITRA, and it's a very important place for the United States from a geopolitical standpoint. And we have to realize that these international goals, we're going to have scientific goals, but they'll also have these other payoffs, including this international engagement. And at this point in our history, we need to be engaged with friendly governments as well as ones that maybe the ones that aren't friendly we can't help, but the ones that are friendly with us, we need engagement, and this is a great way to do it, is by collaborating, and they all want to do it.
Okay, Dr. Khan, on behalf of the whole panel and everybody here, thank you very much. We very much appreciate you being here and your remarks and observations. A couple things as we close out the open session. First, I want to just take a moment to thank those who have provided their financial support to the panel, Open Philanthropy, and Ms. Jamie Yassif, who was here. I think she had to leave about an hour ago or so, but debt of gratitude to them, and also the Hudson Institute, our fiscal sponsor, done a lot to keep this the panel moving forward. We appreciate it very much. So now I think we're going to have a closed session. We're going to have it in here. So those of you who are on the list for the closed session, feel free to stay here, but I think we'll take a 5-minute break and clear the room and resume. Thanks very much. Thanks, Doctor.
Is the rest of the program closed?
Yeah, so we have,
And they all know whether they've made it or not.
you're the best. Look at that. If you're a good senator, I'll let you have one.
I've got something in my bag. I'm gonna go get
Yeah,
it.
you sure? That looks really good.
Okay, all right. I'll let Patricia know, because they do have a list. Yeah, thanks.
We're meeting you.
Oh, it's okay. Don't worry. We have the photographer. We have the photographer.
Oh, I took a picture of you anyway, with your hair down. How'd you get so tall?
This is my friend Patty.
Hi, Patty. I'm Larry.
Nice to meet you.
Asha and I went to grad school together.
Asha and I went to undergrad together.
Seriously? So, did you do the same work?
Similar work.
My name's Ryan.
Ryan, I'm Ken Wainstein. Hey, nice to see you.
Yeah, I work over at GW in public health laboratory.
Uh-huh.
We actually had more of a personal question. So I'm also a grad student. That's what I was doing. Like that, we're like that. But I'm interested. I'm not going to tell you research.
We were an undergrad at Hopkins together, and then I went to Chapel Hill.
So I guess just based on your experience.
A little more. I can show you that.
Good to meet you. Whether you or if you had someone you could refer me to. Same here. We'll talk back to work.
Okay.
We'll talk later. Opportunities. Oh, this is fun. Yeah, I'm enjoying it. Interesting.
Back to the work, right? Back to the work.
Well, I talked to the FBI
Yeah.
agent here. Did you talk to him?
Yeah.
Okay, talk to him. Because obviously your skill would be, your background would be very useful there. You know, I could help you, I could talk to you about DOJ stuff. You know, that's a little bit less direct.
Staffers could,
Well, what I'm interested in is more taking on
and then Nate Reynolds is another person that,
science-based stuff, but I'm not necessarily interested in some lab research. I'm more interested in going into
if
the
they tell you and you're okay with it, that's what I say is okay.
Homeland Security, more of the
Another one of the
NASDAQ
speakers,
realm,
speaker.
and applying that skill set there.